I must tell you, I am very excited for our little session today because for the first time I will be presenting you some books that you have specifically requested that I find for you. And you gave me lots of different ideas, so thank you very much. It was a treasure trove of sensations, styles, desires, preferences, ideas. You gave me so many leads to follow with regards to my future reading. So thank you for that. So it was quite hard to choose just one topic for our library session today. But I have chosen a category quite close to my heart, and that is Australian literature. So you expressed an interest in some of the best stories from my homeland, and that was very generous of you to acknowledge that outside of Australia, probably most of our literature is relatively unknown. But I think you will find that actually among literary communities, some Australians are among some of the most famous authors in the world, just like some of the most famous Hollywood actors in the world are Australian. But of course, our authors are nowhere near as famous as our Hollywood stars. So I have 3 books for you today, and they are all from different times, and I would say they are in different styles, but they are all novels and they are all prose. There is a whole world of Australian storytelling that I could share with you, and it was very difficult to pick just 3, but then again the possibilities are limitless as long as you are still keen to come back to the library. I'm very glad if you are. So, let us begin. The first book I have for you today is called Orpheus Lost, and it is by Janet Turner Hospital. So it's a novel. Janet Turner Hospital is very well known in Australia, and she is an award-winning writer. Her most famous book was called Due Preparations for the Plague, which is a very intriguing title, I'm sure you'll agree. A little like Orpheus Lost, in fact, because Orpheus is, of course, an ancient Greek myth. Now, do you know the myth, the legend, I should say, the legend of Orpheus? Just a little, yeah. All of those Greek myths are kind of hard to keep track of over the years from school and from your own reading, and of course so many of them are very long and involved, so The legend of Orpheus is that when his wife Eurydice died, he made a deal to bring her back from the underworld. But the deal was that on his way out, he was not allowed to look back at her. But of course, Orpheus could not resist a glance back at his beloved. And in the way of a Greek tragedy, his wife was taken back to the underworld and lost to him forever. So it's quite the tragedy. And this book is not completely based on that myth, but it takes inspiration from this idea and from the themes within it. The idea of the underworld and imprisonment and the enduring power of love and the persistence of love, and also the importance of communication in a strange sort of perverted way. But before I go too far, let me read you the blurb. So there's 3 characters in this, Lila, Mishka and Cobb. Here's how it goes. Lila is a mathematical genius who has escaped her small southern town to study in Boston. From the first moment she hears Mishka, a young Australian musician, playing his violin in the subway, his music grips her, and they quickly become lovers. Their souls, bodies, lives are fused, and love offers protection of sorts from the violence and anxiety around them, until Lila is taken off the street to an interrogation center somewhere outside the city. There has been an explosion on the underground. Terrorists are suspected and security is high. And Lila's old childhood friend Cobb is conducting a very questionable investigation. Now, he reveals to her that Mishka may not be all he seems, that there may be more to his past than his story of growing up in the Daintree with an eccentric musical family. Lila has already discovered that Mishka is spending some evenings not at the music lab but at a cafe Cobb tells her known to be a terrorist contact point. Who can she believe? In this compelling reimagining of the Orpheus story, Lila travels to an underworld of kidnapping, torture, and despair in search of the truth and the man she loves. That is possibly the longest blurb ever written. I feel like they basically just told the whole story. But not really. There are some details to understand. One is that Mishka is of, I think, Middle Eastern descent. And when he meets Lila, he is in the midst of developing an interest in a Middle Eastern instrument and in Middle Eastern culture, which really serves to add some fuel on the fire to the interrogator Cobb's suspicions that Mishka has something to do with the terrorist bombing in Boston. This, by the way, was written well before the Boston bombings, so it's quite unfortunately prescient, and it is kind of a unfortunate coincidence, I think. It being set in Boston is really, I think, just because Leela is a very high-level mathematician in university, and probably at Harvard or something, I can't remember. So it really had to take place in a very well-respected, prestigious university town, you know. So there is somewhat of a mystical feeling to the way that Mishka was raised. Now it says here that Mishka was raised in the Daintree, and I think this must be a version for Australia, because an Australian would know what the Daintree is, but I don't expect someone from outside of Australia necessarily to know that the Daintree is a very special, lush, sort of rich piece of rainforest in the northeastern part of Australia. So it's a beautiful tropical rainforest that not many people would live in. And Mishka's upbringing was very strange, unusual, and he doesn't perhaps know his family as well as he should. So when it's a matter of defending his connections to terrorism, he does seem a little suspect, because he is unable to talk about the origins of his family or himself. And what's more, because of, I think, his upbringing and his musical nature and his highly creative nature, he is kind of susceptible, maybe a little naive. So there is a small amount of truth in Cobb's suspicions of him, because Mishka is vulnerable to suggestion by the wrong kinds of people. But at the same time, you have Cobb working on Leela, and it turns out that Cobb, the interrogator, is a old childhood friend of Leela's. They had a very, very, very close upbringing together in the deep south of America, and he may have his own reasons for wanting to cause a rift between Leela and Mishka. So there's a lot going on in this novel plot-wise. It's quite mysterious. It is quite a clever political thriller on one level, and it has something to say about our perceptions of the Middle East, and it has something to say about detention centers. It has pretty clear things to say about that, which, again, very prescient. This was published, I think, in the last decade. 11 years ago, in 9 years ago, 2007. And you may or may not be aware that in Australia, detention is a very, very controversial issue at the moment. And I guess it is the job of writers to be prescient and to perhaps predict the tide, and to get in there with an intellectual and well-reasoned, well-thought-out sort of take on the issue. But this is not a didactic book in any way. It is a love story, definitely, and a thriller, and somewhat esoteric meditation on mathematics and music, and an interesting historical and family story, because of course you have to go into the histories of all these characters to really understand what's happened to them now. So I think the most affecting theme in this book is the kind of sacrifice that a person will undertake for love, just like Orpheus attempting to bring his wife back from the underworld. Leela has to bring her lover back if she possibly can, and do it at the cost of fighting temptation of another kind. So there's so much in this book, but it's kind of sparse. It says a lot in pretty wide text and spacious paragraphs. So it gets a lot done in a brief time, and you have to love a writer who can be quite so concise. I certainly could learn a lot from Janet Turner Hospital, and hopefully she comes back to Australia soon. She has been living in Canada and the US for a very long time, as some of our writers tend to do. There seems to be some sort of attraction in Canada for Australian writers. Probably just that Canada seems like a great place. So let's give you this one to read and move on to the next one. This next one is a bit different, and it's something that we seem to do quite well in Australia, which is the unreal. I don't know what it is about Australian culture and the Australian landscape and environment and circumstances, but our writers over history, ever since European colonisation, have been very interested in recasting Australia in magical realist terms, fantasy terms, Gothic terms. Australian Gothic is a very well-known genre and a very distinct kind of genre that began in literature, but of course has made its way into other media, with films like Wolf Creek being a very good example of modern Australian Gothic. There's something about the Australian landscape that it's just sublime. It's very spooky sometimes, and it can be very intimidating. And if you are accustomed to a more European habitat, then Australia is a very foreign and weird and disconcerting sort of place, and an alienating sort of place. So it's no surprise that for the first 100 years or so of white colonisation in Australia, we were pretty obsessed with really dark stories, dark fiction, and a little bit of the spooky and unreal in our stories, which would generally unfold to be nothing more than, a heightened interpretation of realism, much in the way that an episode of Scooby-Doo always ends with the park, the amusement park owner's mask being ripped off to reveal that he was the one pretending to be the ghost all along. Australian Gothic tends to reveal, perhaps most disconcertingly, that there is nothing supernatural to fear in Australia, because what's real is much more terrifying this is not that kind of story. This is purely a whimsical sort of magical realist fantasy, and it's called Eucalyptus by Murray Bale. Now, if you don't know, eucalyptus is a type of tree. If you live in California or have spent a lot of time there, you would have seen lots of eucalyptuses. They are also known as gum trees, but I don't know if outside Australia they are known better as gum trees or as eucalypts. So, Eucalyptus tells the story of Ellen Holland, who is a young woman described as a speckled beauty, so she has lots of moles, as many Australians do, and she lives on a rural property with her overprotective father. But she is so beautiful that she's renowned the world over. And of course, her father, as she comes of age, her father becomes very concerned about this fact. So he has been, meantime, creating what you might call a museum of trees on his property. It is his life's work to have a specimen of every single type of eucalyptus in the world. And some of them are very easy to come by, but some of them only exist, say, on one rock ledge overhanging some escarpment somewhere deep in the Blue Mountains of New South Wales, where only the most intrepid climber could get it. Anyway, when he is totally panicking about his daughter becoming something of an object of prey to men the world over, Mr. Holland, somewhat fantastically, proposes a sort of contest, which is that the man to correctly identify and name every species of eucalypt on his property may have his daughter's hand in marriage. Which, if it sounds like a fairy tale, is fine, because I think this story is really meant to be a lot like a fairy tale. The characters are pretty shallowly sketched. They are not complex beings. Ellen, the girl, really spends a lot of time just swanning around, skinny dipping in the local water hole, also known as a billabong, and doesn't really ever express any particular thoughts or feelings about the fact that her father is finding her a suitor on his own. But despite this sort of mythical beauty and mythical storyline, it actually comes across quite believable, and it's very charming. And I think if I were to recommend any book to someone who had never been to Australia and wanted perhaps to understand at the same time our literature and our landscape, this would be the book that I would recommend. It doesn't tell you a whole lot about our culture, but it's so lush in its descriptions of eucalypts. It's so lovingly faithful to their majesty. And if you've ever stood at the base of a ghost gum, you'll know exactly what kind of majesty I'm talking about. The story also contains lots of short stories. Murray Bale is a very accomplished short story writer, and he will quite often introduce a species of eucalypt to the property and then proceed on to a short story explaining the first time that species was discovered, or a time when it was propagated somewhere halfway across the world, and the story of the characters involved in these incidences. So as suitors come and go, and as one particularly tenacious suitor goes about cataloguing every single eucalypt on the property, much to Ellen's complete disinterest. We also get diverted by these little explorations into the travels of Eucalyptus all over the world. I said charming. I stand by it. It is a very charming story, and you won't see the ending coming. It's a very, very satisfying ending. And I would love to be there with you when you read the last pages, but I probably won't, so you'll just have to let me know how you went with it. So, this one is based on a true story, and it's not an Australian story that it is based on, but the main character is Australian, and that's pretty much where the connection with Australia ends. Well, that and the fact that the author is Australian. This is People of the Book by Geraldine Brooks. Geraldine Brooks is one of our most celebrated novelists, but she's also a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who spent a lot of time covering wars in the Middle East. So this is kind of the perfect subject matter, because this book is based on the true story of an ancient Jewish codex called the Sarajevo Haggadah, which was rescued from a fire, a bombing fire, from a Muslim librarian. So a very, very sacred Jewish book rescued by a Muslim, a librarian who was willing to risk everything to save this piece of work. Now, to start with, the Haggadah is important because, unlike most texts, old holy texts, it's actually illuminated and illustrated with coloured paintings. So it is priceless. So it's a good subject to base a story around. It's kind of like the Da Vinci Code. It's like a version of the Da Vinci Code with actual substance and written by someone who can write a sentence and a character. So let me just read you the blurb. People of the Book crosses continents and centuries to bring stories of hope amidst darkness, compassion amidst cruelty, all bound together by the discoveries made by a young Australian woman restoring an ancient Hebrew book. When Hannah Heath gets a call in the middle of the night in her Sydney home about a precious medieval manuscript that has been recovered from the smouldering ruins of war-torn Sarajevo, she knows she is on the brink of the experience of a lifetime. A renowned book conservator, she must now make her way to Bosnia to start work on restoring the Sarajevo Haggadah, a Jewish prayer book, to discover its secrets and piece together the story of its miraculous survival. But the trip will also set in motion a series of events that threaten to rock Hannah's orderly life, including her encounter with Osran Karaman, the young librarian who risked his life to save the book. As meticulously researched as all of Brooks's previous work, People of the Book is a gripping novel about war, art, love, and survival. Well, those are 4 very compelling subjects. I think you will agree. So, let's leave aside for a second the fact that Hannah is a renowned book conservator, which is almost as on the nose as Jacques Saunier being a renowned curator in the Da Vinci Code. This is a much more credible version of the importance of art in our culture, and what our holy artifacts mean to us, and how they can be symbols of hope. So this novel is not only told from Hannah's point of view. What it does is it goes back through the history of the Haggadah to explore the number of different places that the Codex lived, from its rescue to its removal, in fact, to its life well before it was in Sarajevo, to its very origins, and to its very mysterious artist. So Hannah is given the task of restoring and conserving the book, and in doing so she discovers some things that make her very much question the actual origins of the piece of history, of the artifact that she is working with. I won't say too much more about that, except to say that the subject of authenticity of historical artifacts is much more fascinating to me now. And of course we know there are so many historical examples of precious, precious art being lost simply because of war. And, you know, in my idealistic fantasies, art is impervious to human vicissitudes of faction forming and warmongering, and that one of the most sacred things in all sieges and attacks should be the art and culture, and all of the pretty buildings should be left alone, and all of the pretty artwork should be left alone. And you can take the people, but you can't replace the art. As twisted as that attitude might be, I think what this novel does really well is draws a parallel between the irreplaceable nature of historical artifacts and the irreplaceable nature of individual persons. So something fun you can do if you're interested in this book is to Google People of the Book, Geraldine Brooks review Ursula K. Le Guin. So Ursula K. Le Guin is a very, 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 very famous world-celebrated science fiction author, and she reviewed this book when it first came out, and it's a extremely lucid, cutting, insightful review, but I found it amusing because I loved this book, and Ursula K. Le Guin basically savaged it very gently savaged it, like a backhanded slap. So I think that's a great counterpoint. You have me here telling you that this is a wonderful book and that it's a million times better written than the Da Vinci Code and much more interesting, and also probably a much more accurate rendering of history, much less fanciful rendering of history, and it's much more accomplished prose. But on the other hand, Ursula K. Le Guin, whose opinion we absolutely must respect, did not rate it so highly. So I love a good stoush over a book. I love to imagine in the future we will be famously referring back to the time that Ursula K. Le Guin savaged Geraldine Brooks, and oh how funny it was that those two contemporary authors were sledging each other across the pages of the Guardian book review, as we now do with George Eliot savaging Jane Austen. So read it, think of it what you will, and do let me know what you think of it. So that concludes today's exploration into Australian literature. I hope that these 3 suggestions spark some interest in you and that you do decide to check out at least one of them. I really am excited to share these artifacts of my own culture with you. And as always, if there is something that you are interested in, some sort of genre, some sort of style that you would like some recommendations in, just let me know and I will see what I can find for you for next time. Okay? And I hope that you are very well. Until next we meet here in the library.